Jetzt darf ich Professor Dr. Patterson auf die Bühne bitten. Leider ist er heute etwas heiser und bat mich, dies zu entschuldigen. Once again, a very warm welcome. We are truly delighted to have you with us tonight, Professor Patterson. Please join us on stage.
So, Honorable Lord Mayor, Dr. Nopper, Professor Menke, members of the Prize Committee, Director of the Hegel-Haus Museum, Ms. Keifel, distinguished guests, it is with profound gratitude and humility that I stand before you today to receive the Hegel Prize in the historic city of Stuttgart. To be recognized in Hegel's name is an honor that resonates deeply, for Hegel has long been both my teacher and my adversary. Such is the paradox of engaging with a thinker of his stature. His ideas demand not blind acceptance, but intellectual struggle. Hegel himself would insist that truth emerges dialectically from contradiction and negation, not compliance. As he once famously wrote, spirit is power only by looking the negative in the face and struggling with it. I have spent a long time looking Hegel in the face. It is this spirit of productive tension that has guided my engagement with Hegel throughout my career. I was introduced to him more than 60 years ago by the Caribbean intellectual C.L.R. James, a fellow Hegelian, a Marxist, and a towering mind of the West Indies. It is to James, my mentor and fellow West Indian, that I dedicate the prize today. Freedom, as Hegel taught us, is the essence of history, a force unfolding through time, giving shape to human destiny. He famously claimed that history is nothing but the progress of freedom's realization, the evolution of human self-awareness as free beings. Such a claim, bold and idealistic, defined the very course of modernity and infused Western thought with an optimism that freedom would eventually prevail. At the close of the 20th century, it seemed as though this vision was coming to fruition. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the sweeping embrace of democratic ideals throughout the non-Western world, and Francis Fukuyama's proclamation of the end of history suggested that humanity had arrived at its Hegelian endpoint, a world governed by rational, liberal states in which freedom would reign supreme. how different the world looks today. The dialectic has taken a darker turn. The world is witnessing a reversal of this historic promise, a threatened collapse of democracy, the rise of populist nationalism, and the decay of the values that once underpinned the free world. Most alarmingly, these developments are unfolding in the very heartland of the Western freedom. France, Britain, and America, where leaders exploit the rhetoric of liberty while undermining its most sacred principles. The political scientist Larry Diamond aptly calls this moment a democratic recession. My task today is not to diagnose this decline, a challenge I gladly leave to political scientists, but to ask a more fundamental question, as Hegel himself would have done. In the few minutes I have with you, I'd like to return to first principles, to revisit the origins, the nature, and meaning of freedom itself. What is this freedom that we cherish so deeply and now fear losing? How did we arrive here? What was the Geist, the spirit of history, that brought us to this point? To answer these questions, as Hegel has taught us, we must begin at the beginning. We must follow freedom's journey from its inception through its transformation to its current state of fragmentation. Freedom, I should begin, and here I differ from most philosophers who work on the subject, as did Hegel, is not an innate human aspiration. It's not. It was not a value universally produced by all peoples at all times. If it had been, we would find freedom celebrated in every culture throughout history. We do not. Until the middle of the 20th century, freedom remained almost entirely a Western ideal. To the extent that other cultures exhibit freedom, it was largely adopted from the West or imposed upon these countries at the point of a gun, as was true of Japan. Why is this? Because, as Professor Menke has so kindly anticipated what I have to say and explained in great depth, freedom was born in opposition to its darkest antithesis, slavery. And I'm going to repeat some of what Professor Menke says, but I'm going to elaborate in some detail on the inner dynamics of what was generated by slavery. Without slavery, freedom as a cherished ideal would not have come into existence. The condition of slavery, its perverse degradation, its annihilation, its destruction of the enslaved person's humanity created the yearning for freedom as liberation. As Hegel once wrote in one of his most remarkable insights, this comes from the lectures in the philosophy of history. Interestingly, in the latter half of the work discussing freedom among the Germans during the Middle Ages, he wrote, and this is one of my inspiring passages from Hegel, he wrote, "Mankind has liberated itself not so much from enslavement as through enslavement." Quite a remarkable passage. Slavery imposes a unique form of domination. The slaveholder, the master, holds absolute power over the life and death of the slave. The slave is alienated from his ancestry and community, a condition I term natal alienation, and the slave is reduced to a state of social death, stripped of all recognition, honor, and autonomy. Hegel understood the existential implications of this condition. In the phenomenology of spirit, he makes the fear of death the central motif of the master-slave dialectic in the celebrated chapter 4 of that master work. The slave is subjected by the master's will, denied recognition as a human being. Yet out of this subjection emerges a profound contradiction. Not, as many commentators have argued, not really so much of recognition, but of motivation. A socially dead person lacks all motivation to serve well and to enrich the agent of his social death, obviously. To solve this problem, the enslaver exploits the one thing that the slave most desires: to escape the condition of his social death, to be reborn into social life, to reclaim his personhood. In this struggle for motivated worker and rebirth into social life, the first note of freedom is jointly constructed by master and slave. In the master's desire for a better slave worker, and in the slave desire to escape his death. Negative freedom is born in this desire, in this mutual desire. The freedom to be liberated from domination. We've come to call this negative freedom. But the dialectic of slavery creates another value. The master, in exercising absolute power over the slave, discovers a new ideal: the freedom to dominate, to impose one's will without constraint. This does not happen outside of the master-slave relationship, even among the most primitive society, and even among the most authoritarian society, there are always restraints on the power of people. And it is in this experience of domination that the second note of freedom is created. Positive freedom. The freedom to exercise power over this and others and over oneself. Finally, the shadow of slavery rises the status of the free man, the native whose identity is defined in opposition to the enslaved outsider. Linguistically, this truth is embedded in the very origins of the word freedom. It's Indo-European root, and it's found in no other family of languages. Priya means beloved, belonging to a group whose members are not enslaved. This is an unusual invention. Before slavery, there's no need for a group to go around saying, I'm free. Why? Only in the face of an enslaved group will one consider oneself a beloved community who are not slaves. And it's in this third element of freedom, in this third condition, the third element of freedom or note is found. The freedom of being a member of a community, a citizen, part of a demos, as the Greek calls it. Democracy. Freedom then is not one thing, but is best seen as a chord, and I use this musical metaphor throughout my writings. A triadic harmony of three interwoven notes. Freedom as liberation from domination, the slave's freedom, if you like. Freedom as the power to act as one desires. Positive freedom. And freedom as a solidarity of collective belonging, which eventually evolved into the notion of citizenship, part of a demos. Now, we have a problem. If slavery was universal, and my work has shown that slavery is found all over the world, and if freedom has its origin in slavery, why didn't freedom exist all over the world? Why only in the West? Hegel, by the way, grappled with this question. He saw the emergence of freedom as the unique product of the Western Geist, a restless spirit that propelled Western humanity to self-realization. I agree with Hegel's historical conclusion that freedom became central to the West, and that slavery was somehow implicated. But my explanation of how and why this happened differs from his own. And I can see him nodding. Okay, let's hear what you got to say. That's what I like about him. Unlike Hegel, I do not see freedom emerging from some inner rational necessity or something innermost in human beings. And that's why I completely disagree with armchair philosophers who begin by assuming that, freedom is inherent, or, as John Locke liked to put it, written in the human heart. That's nonsense. It's not even written in the human heart of Eastern societies or whatever other society you may want to look at outside of the rest. Rather, it was forged through specific socio-historical conditions and struggles unique to the West. For freedom, originating in this condition of slavery, for it to become institutionalized as a shared value, a supreme value, three developments were necessary. Because think about it. Assuming that freedom was thought of, imagined in the slave condition, the very fact that it emerged in that condition would have condemned it to a lowly status. Okay? So three factors peculiar to the West accounts for the rise of this extraordinary value to prominence, to supremacy. One, a large population of slaves yearning for liberation. Two, the centrality of slavery to the economic and social life of the community, creating the need, the necessity for manumission on a large scale. And third, a social structure in which freed persons could carve out a space for themselves and participate in the life of the community. What historians have come to call a slave society, as distinct from simply a society with slaves, a large-scale slave society. Now, this condition emerged first and only in ancient Greece, especially Athens, beginning in the 6th century and expanding through the 5th century. So what I'm saying is that this is a unique historical experience in the West, which accounts for the peculiar fact that it's only in the West that one finds it. So here, the sociologist in me differs from the philosopher in Hegel. I'm seeing it as a social construction emerging from the fact that in only one time in human history did this peculiar combination of factors exist. And that was in great Athens. This is when the West began. a great slave society emerged. Sustaining its economy and creating a sharp division between the free and the enslaved. Out of this tension emerged the value of eleutheria, personal freedom, as a bond of solidarity among free men, defined in opposition to the slaves, and the large body of freedmen. But Greece's legacy did not end here. In the 4th century BC, philosophers like Plato began to reinterpret freedom as an inner ideal. Outer freedom, freedom from domination, became a metaphor for inner freedom in Plato. And slavery, by the way, was central to Plato's thought, for those of you who aren't aware of it. The late great Princeton classicist, Gregory Vlastos, who's devoted a lifetime of study showing the extraordinary role of slavery in Plato's thought. He internalized the idea. The mastery of reason over the soul's basic desires. Outer freedom was interjected in that way. For Plato, the unfree person was enslaved to his passions internally. He can have true beliefs but cannot know the truth of his belief. While true freedom meant rational discipline of the self, the inner self. So this idea of interjecting the outer experience of freedom out of slavery long preceded Christianity. Of course, it's a model in Stoicism, which Hegel, of course, spent a lot of time pondering and was somewhat critical of in ways I don't entirely agree, but that's another story. After the Greeks, there were 2 further great moments in the founding and institutionalization of freedom. One was the rise of ancient Rome, the supremacy. The other, the emergence within Rome of Pauline Christianity. The Roman Empire, the most vast and complex slave society in history, bigger, by the way, than anything in the United States, played a critical role in further institutionalizing freedom. By the height of the imperial Rome, the very concept of libertas, which is one of the most cherished terms in ancient Rome, and personal freedom. And the only meaning of libertas in Rome is not being a slave. It had become a cherished value, particularly among the large group of freed slaves and their descendants. And they attained great stature. The great Latin poet Horace was the son of an ex-slave, and he was proud of it, by the way. Unlike the Greeks, Roman freedmen were not ashamed of their former slave status. On the contrary, they celebrated their liberation. Tomb inscriptions proudly bore the marks of manumission, depicting freedom as the pinnacle of personal achievement. If you ever visit Italy, go off the beaten tracks, you'll find these monumental tombstones with these inscriptions all over Italy. And what are they saying? I was once a slave, and I had this fantastic experience. I became freed. Horace celebrated his great father. This is the greatest point in Latin, at least sonnets were. It's a major difference from Greece. For Rome's elite, meanwhile, freedom was inseparable from power. The freest man was the most powerful man, most notably the emperor himself. Thus, the Roman ideal of freedom fused its two central notes: freedom as personal autonomy and power, and freedom as personal autonomy and liberation, and freedom as the capacity to exercise dominion over others. The emperor, as the most powerful person, was the most free person. Freedmen, in turn, and what's fascinating about Rome was this extraordinary relationship that developed between freedmen and the emperor. Freedmen found their own place of power and recognition within the imperial system, particularly as priests in the Severi of Gustavus, custodians of the emperor's cult. You find here an extraordinary symbiosis, if you like. The emperor's power protecting the freedman's negative power. The Roman Empire thus amplified and solidified freedom's cord. Liberation from slavery, the exercise of power, and solidarity within the community. Significantly, unlike Greece, when the slave became a freedman, and this is quite extraordinary, he also became a citizen. It also created a socio-historical space for Christianity to flourish. Like Hegel, I think Christianity is central to the rise of freedom and to the rise of the West. As the gospel, but we differ on how this happened. Again, I'm staring him in the face. As the gospel spread through the cities of Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome, Paul's message of spiritual liberation resonated deeply with freedmen and enslaved alike. Indeed, as Professor Menke has mentioned, the Roman freedman's passion for negative freedom and its security in the worship, and it's virtually a worship, of the absolute freedom and power of the divine emperor were to become the model of Christian doctrine. Excuse me. Jesus of Nazareth didn't have much to say about freedom, but of salvation, preparing his followers for the coming kingdom of God. There's no mention of freedom in any of the extant sayings of Jesus. Yet, as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, it absorbed and transformed the language of freedom. It was Paul, Christianity's second founder, the apostle to the Gentiles, who reinterpreted Jesus' message as a theology of freedom. Right there in the hotbed of secular freedom in Rome. Paul's brilliance, and he's without doubt the most important thinker in the Western world, smarter even than Hegel. His brilliance lay in his use of slavery, so pervasive in Rome, as a metaphor for spiritual bondage. Sin, Paul argued, was a form of slavery. To be saved was to be redeemed, a word rooted in the Latin redemptionem, meaning to buy back, to ransom out of slavery. It was as literal as that. Christ's death on the cross was the ultimate act of liberation, a divine manumission that freed humanity from the bondage of sin. For Paul, death was no longer an end, but a dialectical process. And it's fascinating, by the way. We don't read much of Hegel on Christianity, but it's really quite fascinating reading Hegel on the Christian doctrine. This was not especially the way he interpreted it, but I feel somehow that he sensed in a deep way something was going on. So this was a dialectical process for Paul, a passage into a new life. As he wrote in Romans, and this passage is so dialectical, I can't believe that it wasn't something that stirred Hegel. Because every time I read it, I think of Hegel. The death he died. He died to sin once and for all. But the life he lives to God. Oh, what on earth could that mean? Except it's interpreted in an Hegelian sense. It's wonderful. In the letter to the Romans too, Paul interjected, and this is important because not many historians of early Christianity have gone with this idea, but it's clearly there in the text. He interjected the freedman's principle that the freedom of salvation, liberation, celebrated in the earlier letter to the Galatians, and it was the earlier letter, even though it was placed later in the New Testament, found protection and its greatest expression in surrender to the absolute freedom and power of God. This was a direct analog to the freedman celebration of the divinity of Augustus, who had perfect freedom and would protect the freedom. And in fact, in the final analysis, as Paul said, enslavement to God is the ultimate freedom. Now, what could be more Hegelian than that? But anyway, that is how I see it. With Christianity, the Western world's concept of freedom attained a new and profound depth. Freedom became a condition not just of the body or the community, but of the soul. In this vision, liberation was not only from domination, but also from the history of sin and death. The enslaved spirit, Paul taught, could achieve through freedom, through faith in Christ, a freedom that transcends worldly suffering and temporal conditions. Hegel, steeped in Christian philosophy, theology, understood this synthesis. Christianity for him represented a profound reconciliation of freedom's dialectical tensions, the individual's freedom, the collective unity of the church, and the rational, ethical structure of divine order. In this way, the Christian legacy embedded the idea of freedom into the very consciousness of the West. The synthesis of Greek philosophy, Roman liberty, and Christian salvation formed the bedrock of Western freedom. Yet, freedom's development did not end there. From its inception, there were contradictions inherent in both the content and the harmony of this great cultural triad. Each note had both a good and evil possibilities. Positive freedom achieves goodness in its Platonic aspect of self-control, power over one's base, selfish instincts, and the capacity to realize the good ends one defines for oneself. What today, especially among feminist theorists of freedom, is known as empowerment. It's also what the Indian Nobel economist and philosopher Amartya Sen described as capability, defining for oneself the life one wants. However, in freedom as power over others, we see the potential evil side of positive freedom. Dominating others, so it is still there. Likewise, freedom as emancipation, negative freedom, has a good side, obviously, and the independence of one's being, the independent spirit cherished by Hegel. Was a lot to say on this. But negative freedom, as Hegel repeatedly warned, can become the pursuit of selfishness, the complete neglect of one's obligations to one's community. Finally, democracy, membership in the beloved community, can also deteriorate to hatred and contempt for those who do not belong, seeing others as inferior and not worthy of incorporation into the beloved community of freeborn citizens. When democracy becomes an inclusive form of exclusiveness, or an exclusive form of inclusiveness, it descends to the evils of chauvinism and the dehumanization of the outsider, who become murderers, rapists, whatever horrible thing you can think of them. And we saw a perfect example of this in America's most recent election. A second kind of problem in the triad of freedom is the danger of fragmentation. For freedom to thrive, all three notes of the chord must play in harmony. When one note dominates, captured by certain groups who play it at the expense of the other, and you can easily imagine what I'm talking about. Think of the use of liberalism. The chord of freedom is shattered and disharmony emerges. During the Enlightenment, freedom underwent another profound transformation. Philosophers such as Locke, Rousseau, Kant secularized freedom, anchoring it in reason, natural rights, and the emerging ideals of modern democracy. The Enlightenment's emphasis on individual autonomy and self-determination laid the groundwork of modern liberalism and the revolutions that would shape the modern world, the American Revolution, the French Declaration of Rights, and so on. Hegel, writing in the wake of these upheavals, sought to reconcile freedom's conflicting dimensions. For Hegel, true freedom was not merely the absence of constraint or the ability to exercise power, positive freedom. It was the integration of individual autonomy with rational, ethical structure of society. Freedom, he argued, achieves its highest form. The ethical life realized through the family, civil society, and the state. In this way, Hegel's vision transcended both liberal individualism and authoritarian state power, offering a synthesis that remains as relevant today as it was in his time. Where does this leave us? If I may conclude. At the height of the post-war era, the West came closer than ever to achieving freedom's triadic harmony. The welfare states of Europe, and to a lesser extent, post-war America, provided a balance between negative freedom, the right to do as one pleases, positive freedom, the capacity to achieve one's goals, empowerment, and collective freedom, democratic solidarity, and the rule of law. Yet, as we enter the 21st century, the harmony began to unravel. Neoliberalism, an ideology that prizes individual autonomy at the expense of community and equality, has distorted the chord of freedom. Negative freedom, the freedom from constraint, has been elevated to such an extreme that it now undermines the other notes of the triad. The rich and the powerful have exploited this imbalance, using their positive freedom to accumulate obscene levels of wealth and power while eroding the freedom of others. In America today, 3 individuals, 3, own more than the entire bottom 50% of America. Think about that. What would Hegel have thought of that? 3 individuals in the richest country in the world owning more than the bottom half of the entire economy. I assume you don't have such an affair in Germany. Not yet. entire regions as a result of this extremely discordant rise of liberalism have been hollowed out, leaving communities, vast areas of America, impoverished and despairing. The result is not freedom but alienation for the working poor and for many in the middle classes, for those suffering from what has been called deaths of despair, as the number of suicides have increased exponentially in America, as the life expectancy of the richest country in the world has declined. For communities fractured by economic collapse, freedom has lost its meaning. This fragmentation has opened the door to the false gospel of populist authoritarianism. Leaders promise to restore the beloved community, to reclaim the spirit of freedom, even as they erode the very institutions that make freedom possible. At this moment, we see the consequences of a freedom distorted and untethered from what Hegel felt was so fundamental, from his ethical foundation, a freedom divorced from responsibility, solidarity, and reason. Hegel would have been appalled by this state of affairs, appalled. For him, freedom is not the absence of obligations, as I mentioned, but the alignment of individual will with rational ethical principles, to repeat. And one cannot repeat that enough. True freedom, he taught, is self-determination, a freedom grounded in recognition of one's place within the larger rational order. It is also self-realization, the capacity to become fully oneself. So in a way, he was fully in tune with this triad, even though he didn't use that language. And finally, for him, it is reconciliation, the harmony between personal autonomy and societal obligation. What we face today, especially in that leader of the free world, the richest society in the history of the world, is the breakdown of this reconciliation, so central to Hegel's doctrine of freedom. Trust, as countless surveys by sociologists and political scientists have shown, trust in institutions have collapsed in America. The Supreme Court, the Congress, the presidency. Every survey shows people, less than 20% of people, having any trust in their institutions. Inequality has deepened, communities have fractured under the weight of economic and cultural despair. And under such conditions, the ethical life, sittlich halt, becomes impossible. Honorable guests, Honorable Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, we stand at the crossroads. The story of freedom, as Hegel reminds us, is a story of struggle, of contradictions that demand resolution. Our task now is not to despair, but to act, to reclaim freedom's triadic harmony, to restore the balance between liberation, empowerment, and the solidarity of the demos, and to renew our commitment to this most sacred of Western values. Lord Mayor, Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for this extraordinary honor and for the privilege of sharing these reflections with you today. May we, in the spirit of Hegel, commit ourselves to the work of freedom's renewal. Thank you. Thank you.